Alright, time for part 6 in my tutorial series where I walk you through a top-level view of my workflow when it comes to creating a real-time character from scratch. So everything from concept art to rigging, animation, and so on. I'll cover a lot of disciplines and software and hopefully give you an idea of where to look and what to do in order to learn more about this stuff. If you want to support the making of these videos, you can find me on Patreon, link in the description. Yeah, this is an exciting part. I love texturing. Once you got the model into Substance Painter, the first thing you want to do is bake all the mesh maps. These are the maps that tell Substance Painter where all the crevices are, how thick different parts of the mesh are, and so on. And the smart maps are gonna use these in order to create all these nifty little effects. Other than that, Substance painting is largely about creating masks. I have a quite substantial library of smart materials and so on that I can recommend getting from sources like ArtStation, their store, or what is it called? Inverted normals. Let me check. Flipped normals. It's another great store place to get interesting and useful smart materials. I don't want to make unnecessary work for myself, so for example, the skin material I'm using here is one of the quite standard skin materials that I've tweaked a bit to better fit my needs. So I'm using this as a base. I'm using a sort of a reddish version of that skin for the inside of the mouth and so on. The metal here, it's the great thing about Substance Painter, it's kind of take care of itself. I have a lot of smart materials for metals. I think I got most of them from the ArtStation store. And just make sure that if you're creating something for commercial purposes, make sure to check the licenses for the assets you're getting. On ArtStation, I stick to assets that have the extended commercial license option. It costs a little bit more, but it allows you to use them for projects like this where, eventually I'm hopefully gonna have this first-person shooter that I can put out on Steam and so on. Other than that, a lot of masking. Make sure to properly mask everything so that you can see here the belt buckle and the belt itself has a separate material from the jeans, even though they're in a combined mesh more or less. And I also ended up doing this the inside of the pants, added this sort of gore texture since the purpose for this thing is to blow up, and I was thinking of keeping the legs separate from the torso so the legs remain after the explosion. Now, there are a couple of different ways of masking. One method is by UV island. So you can basically click on the mesh and it's going to figure out what UV island is that face a part of, and you mask that area. The most basic one is a brush where you can paint the mask, and it's something I used for the inside of the mouth and the decal with the fire warning on the propane tank and so on. You can also mask things based on mesh, what mesh they're part of. And the pants, I think it's actually separated in a couple of different meshes, even if it's exported as a single FBX. So that makes it easy for me to just go in and say this sub-mesh is the belt, this sub-mesh is the belt buckle. this submesh is only the jeans and so on, while the gore texture on the top of the jeans, that one I just used a painting brush to mask out. And also, again, play around, have fun. I'm adding to the jeans here actually a metal wear and tear texture, and I think, hey, this looks kind of cool. It's almost as if the pants have been spattered with paint and all that stuff. But make sure to go in and expand the entire metal, check all the sub parts, and I did this. I went in and made sure that there's nothing writing to the metal map. So, well, metal wear and tear, of course. Most likely you're gonna have some metal components, so get rid of those. Otherwise, when you start baking in Blender, you're gonna have these metal parts on the pants, which will look kind of odd once you're in Unity later on. I think I'm also experimenting a bit with wood textures and leather textures, and I often end up using leather textures for the skin, as you can see here, to add a little more roughness and those kind of details. And yeah, again, here's a smart mask, making sure that this texture only appears deep in the crevices and so on, and I modify it and blur it, and yeah, play around. And another thing you want to keep in mind is here you can see how I'm changing all the different parts of a texture from UV projection to triplanar projection. Triplanar is basically a technique where you're projecting a texture in 3D space along the X, Y, Z axis instead of onto the UV map. Otherwise, when you're using UV projections, you can run into issues where you've placed seams in places that are quite visible. So you'll see these strange artifacts where the UV seams are. Thankfully, triplanar solves most of that, and I tend to stick with it. Otherwise, you have to put more effort into the UV maps and actually hiding all the seams and so on. And you can see how I did a lot of work to the skin texture, which is probably the most important one here. And essentially, I'm using a bunch of presets materials together with some fill materials and so on, and smart masks that take into account crevices and thickness and so on. And for details like the decal, I think it's decal. How the hell is that pronounced in English? Anyway, the little paper note on the tank with the fire warning, I just did that in texture. I made sure to set the base normal a bit, the height a bit further up than the metal material, so it actually looks like a piece of paper is stuck on it. Other than that, I mean, this is a lot of playing around and seeing what works. The grenade here, I started with a green sort of painted material, and then I'm selected again, masking the specific parts that need to be metal only with no paint, so all the details here on the top. As with the risk of sounding repetitious, again, practice. Have fun with it and try a lot of different things. Try metals, woods, plastic, plaster, fabric, skin, all that stuff, and work out what works for you. And when you have materials that you really like, you can save them as your own smart material presets. Alright, with the texturing done, it's time for the material setup. So what you first want to do is export all the textures from Substance so you can use them in Blender. You can see how I'm using the PBR output template, and then I just go through the materials and make sure that I'm only exporting the materials I need or rather textures I need, so I don't have a lot of unnecessary textures cluttering everything up and making it difficult to find the ones I need. So I'm using the OpenGL normal textures, the metal textures, roughness textures, and the diffuse textures. I'm also exporting the thickness map from Substance as a separate map in order to use that for the subsurface scattering later on. Once I'm here in Blender, I bring all the relevant materials in. I usually use a multiply node in order to add a little extra ambient occlusion. So yeah, of course I export the ambient occlusion map as well. Other than that, hook up the normal map through a normal map node in Blender and make sure that the color space is set to non-color. And yeah, do the same for the roughness and the metal map there. Set them to non-color instead of sRGB. I also tend to, when doing the subsurface scattering map, first I need to invert it because, well, Blender and Substance has a bit of differing opinion on what should be bright and dark as far as thickness goes. Then I use a brightness contrast node in order to be able to tweak the strength of the subsurface scattering. Well, that's pretty much it. Do the same for all the materials you're using. I'm using a couple different here for the torso, the legs, and so on. Once everything is hooked up, this is our high poly textured model. This is the model that we are going to bake from. And in the next part, we're gonna get started on the low poly model. And well, I'm gonna go through the sort of quick and dirty way of making a low poly model. I have another project which I recorded before this one, where I do a proper retopology pass, because it's a, well, this model is a sort of it's meant to be this frantic, crazy thing. It's not huge, it's human-sized. It's charging you and it's going boom. So I don't need to be too fine or, you know, what do you want to call it? Too precise with all the parts that need to be deformed and so on. I mean, I just need to get it in the ballpark and the player will be non-device there. So yeah, next part, a very quick and dirty sort of low poly model pass on this. I've started calling it the Mutasomb. No, the Muta tank. A combination of a mutant and a propane tank. But yeah, as usual, thank you so much for watching, and I hope I'll see you in part. What's the next one? 7? Yeah, 7.